For the last few years, I would say it's been tough for art and entertainment to tackle the conversations about quote-unquote wokeness in the classroom. But at last, it may finally be over. Today on the show, you'll hear how English teacher handles a sensitive conversation and manages to be funny about it. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. All right, listen. This week it is back to school, and that is also showing up in new TV shows.
You know, the kids this year, I feel like they're less woke. Did you notice that?
Oh,
They're not into being woke anymore.
It's circled back around.
It's circled all the way around.
Yes.
And now they're like for what they say they're against.
Right, and they're saying the R word again.
Like you had that kid, what was he saying about the Spanish Inquisition?
I had to teach both sides of the Spanish Inquisition. He got
so
upset, he started
insane.
crying.
And I have these kids that are showing me AI porn of Oscar Wilde having sex with women. He was gay.
That is a scene from English Teacher. It is a new show that just dropped this week on Disney+. Time magazine is calling it the best new sitcom of the year because it does something that is pretty rare for a sitcom, which is it actually manages to get into one of the most controversial discussions of the moment, which is the rise of so-called woke culture and how it's kind of playing out in our schools. But also managed to do this in an accessible, non-judgmental, and kind of funny way. Rad Simonpillai and Mel Woods have both seen the show. Rad, Mel, welcome back to the show, friends.
Hello.
Hello. Please try not to say anything too controversial during this episode. Rad, set this up for us. What is English Teacher all about, and why did you start watching it? And I'm asking this because you famously hate television.
I feel attacked by your warning. Let me just say,
Sure.
The woke culture is taking over now.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, the show absolutely hilarious. It's about a teacher in Austin navigating the culture wars. You know, being in this really liberal town in like one of the most conservative states, right, Texas. And look, I mean, the show comes across as sort of like an older skewing Abbott Elementary, but in a different location, like a different geographical region, raunchier, all that stuff. Still feel good somehow, which is kind of incredible because this is a show that's, you know, it's wading into race and cultural sensitivities and the whole woke culture thing you talked about and gender identity, all these things that I understand that, like, you know, our listeners might be like, like, do we really
that sounds
want
thorny?
to go
Yeah.
there? Yeah. Like, do we really want comedians tackling these kinds of topics after we've had like Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais and Matt Rife and all of them do their thing where they're punching down? But the difference here with English Teacher is that this is a show that speaks the language. You know, this is a show that comes from like people who are progressive and understand what they're talking about and are not bringing these kind of bad faith arguments to the show. And that basically opens the door to this being just absolutely hilarious.
Okay, Mel, you know what I love? I love a sitcom that is created by its lead star. That's like the best dynamic you possibly ask for. Quinta Brunson, of course, the creator of Abbott Elementary. And in this particular case, the lead star is also the creator, Brian Jordan Alvarez. But the thing that we know Brian Jordan Alvarez for is not this. It's probably this.
Sirim is the opposite of standing. Sitting is the opposite of running around. And sitting is a wonderful thing to do because you sitting. Sitting is the opposite of standing on your head.
Oh boy. Okay, there he is with sitting. You know, sitting is the opposite of standing. This is a song, quote unquote song, let's say, that went viral last year. Vanity Fair called it the hottest track of September 2023 because it blew up on TikTok. Let's talk about Brian Jordan Alvarez because he's kind of known for absurdist humor on the internet, but now, and also like being sort of maybe playing bit parts on sitcoms here and there. But now you get to this moment with English Teacher. Tell us about where he came from and how he arrived at this moment.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people like to attribute him to TikTok, but I know him from this web series that he made back in 2016 called The Gay and Wondrous Life of Caleb Gallo.
Mel, are you
And
like
I
to
think that-
hipster us about Brian Jordan Alvarez? I love to see it.
I know. I
Go
was
off.
there before he was cool, but I think I think that web series shares a lot of DNA with this show because it was such a singular kind of comedic voice. Stephanie Koenig, who's I guess a supporting actress on the show, also a writer, was also involved in that project with him. And I think what they share between them is they come from a very distinctly queer sensibility. I mean, that show's literally called The Gay and Wondrous Life of Caleb Gallo, and it was doing things around representation, around having a very gay, very trans, very gender diverse cast. And there are bits and jokes from it that have that same sort of dry humor that this show has. And so, you know, for people who have been watching him, you know, grind it out on social media, grind it out in this like really heavily self-produced indie stuff to get this sort of a big break on such a mainstream network, to get the money and the time and the agency to tackle some of these issues, it's really, really exciting because I think he's a voice that, you mentioned Quinta with Abbott Elementary. He brings a very singular vision to this. He brings a very specific perspective. It's a very queer perspective, but it's also a perspective of kind of openness and empathy to having these conversations and not just shutting the door on them, but also not turning them into an after-school special. And I think that is really reflective of his previous work.
It's the thing that Rad said earlier is sticking out in my brain, the idea that like these are pretty thorny topics that like you would, if you were to hear the premise of the show, you go, I don't want to go anywhere near this thing. This sounds like it could be sort of all kinds of, a rod for controversy. But Mel, what's interesting about the show is that it's kind of bringing us into these conversations about wokeness, about how the way that we talk about gender is changing through the eyes of a cis queer man who's trying to figure this stuff out for himself as well. How does that work for you in the show as you watch it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene early on where he's like brought in to give a talk to a gym class about non-binary identity because he's the most knowledgeable about that topic that the gym teacher can find. And it actually is, what I really appreciate about it is that the kids actually know all of that stuff. It's all a bit for the kids to film him on TikTok and make fun of him. And that's what I really like about the show is it gives the kids agency. These kids are complicated figures. In that opening clip we heard about them pushing back on things or coming around on some of these topics. And I think that's really reflective of real life. We look at the ways that misinformation, bad ideas, quote unquote, spread amongst really young people on social media and whatnot. And I think this show is kind of trying to get at that with the sort of like empathy and warmth of somebody trying their best, but maybe not always getting it right or perfect, but still trying their best. And I really appreciate that kind of, it's warmer than I expected it to be, honestly, because it is such a dry thing. But I think his central character really grounds it as this openness, this empathy, and this willingness to hopefully find the best in people, even if it can be some nasty teens, making fun of him.
Well, I'll tell you what's really striking to me about this conversation, Rad. I haven't seen the show yet. So like what's striking to me is the words that both of you keep using. Like Mel just used warmth and empathy. Earlier you used the word compassion. Again, not a subject matter that we're used to having these words accompany, especially when it's sort of trying to be funny. How do you think the show, do you have like an example of the way that the show works in the comedic into the compassionate view of whatever wokeness might be? How does that work itself into the show?
Yeah, I mean, I think this show consistently, it gets at the surface level humor. It mocks the things you might expect it to, but then it keeps taking the conversation further and breaking it down and giving you more empathy and insight, but not in a way that could have been after school special, like Mel said earlier, but isn't. It's actually still stays sharp. And one example is so there's 2 episodes available right now. Yeah. The second episode it's about the jocks in the school trying to perform drag, right? And that offends the LGBT club who want to shut them down. And automatically you get the surface level jokes of, okay, why is the LGBT club, the group that celebrates inclusivity, trying to shut down and trying to be not inclusive of the jocks? So you get all the humor from that, but then you get into this conversation about what their actual anxieties are. Well, the jocks, they want to perform drag not because they love this culture, but because they find it funny. It's kind of ridiculing, right? So you get to that point, and then the whole episode becomes about bringing in a drag instructor to really teach these jocks to actually learn and love drag culture, and that becomes really instructive for the show as a whole, or for just how culture handles this kind of comedy, because you have to approach it with the right attitude. You have to approach it with love and affection and actual real knowledge and understanding. So that's one example of how it just takes things further and really re-energizes these conversations.
Something that really struck me. Okay, so I was watching the trailer and I had a big laugh at this moment.
I was diagnosed with asymptomatic Tourette's.
What?
It's like Tourette's syndrome, but without any symptoms.
Right, just that moment has everything. I think it has everything that you're talking about there. What does that little bit of the trailer tell us about the level of that this show is operating on, you think?
Okay, so first off, everything I'm talking about, in terms of deepening conversations and stuff, this is an episode that's dealing with oppression Olympics, and if you don't know what that is, that's a cynical idea that marginalized people of different marginal identities are in a competition. If I were to all of a sudden throw down and say, look, guys, I'm more oppressed than y'all, that's oppression Olympics. And so you have this episode about these white girls engaging in that, and where it comes out the other end was actually a mic drop. I was just wow, this is why these girls could play these power games. Yeah. The other level of genius is the girl they cast to play the girl that claims to have asymptomatic Tourette's. And that is Sofia Coppola's daughter, Romy Mars, who you might remember was really famous for a TikTok video where she tried to make pasta because she was grounded for trying to charter a helicopter on her dad's credit card.
We'll never forget. We'll never
forget that moment.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the idea that they cast this girl who became famous for hilariously owning her Nepo baby privilege in the most, in the most hilarious ways. They cast her as a girl who now desperately wants to be oppressed. Because that's the new cultural cachet. Stroke of genius.
Yeah, that's really funny. That's a really, really funny reversal. Mel, the thing that we keep talking about, this sort of frame of the cultural divide, whatever that might look like, is the show an attempt to bridge that? Or can the show do that? Or is that not really what the purpose of the show is, you think?
I think that there's a certain segment of particularly down in America in some of these places that, they turn on this show, they see Trixie Mattel, the drag queen they're going to turn it off. We're not going to be like mending those bridges necessarily within that certain segment of the population. But I think for those, and I hate to talk about these things in a binary because they aren't, but for people in the middle, quote unquote, or people who I think right now, parents, we see this with the parental rights movement, not to get all serious here for a moment, but we see this kind of like, parents are afraid of quote unquote wokeness. Parents are afraid of what their kids are learning at school. Parents are afraid of these conversations. Fear is being stoked in parents to be afraid of these things. And so I think a show like this of showing how these kinds of conversations actually are happening in schools and are complicated and are messy and muddy, and not everybody is getting things right. But there are people who really mean well for kids and come in a place for meaning well for kids, I think is a really great message. And again, but not being after school especially. It comes from a place of, I think, showing that having these conversations is not something to be scared of. It's not something to be afraid of. And actually it makes kids' lives better, teachers' lives better, parents' lives better to engage with these sorts of topics with an openness, with that empathy, with that warmth, and rather than shying away from them. So as for the people who are really far gone, I don't know if it's going to bring them over because I don't think they'll come in the door. But for a lot of folks who are having big questions around these sorts of things right now, I think the show's a really good vehicle for facilitating those kinds of conversations.
Okay, the thing that you just got out there, though, the idea that like this is serious, it has real life consequences. I think that matters because those issues are playing out in ways that are not just funny, that are not people who are just kind of sort of having a laugh. Like it's impacting policies, it's impacting real lives in the world. And so I guess to that end, Rad, not everyone feels the same about the show as the two of you do. Over at RogerEbert.com, Brian Tellerico wrote, every time that it feels like English teacher is going to drown in the treacherous waters of mocking a culture, his team find a way out of it, whether it's by appending the expectation or just avoiding the hot button issue altogether. And I think Brian might be trying to say English teacher kind of lacks teeth in the moment when he needs to have teeth. What do you make of that critique?
I mean, I wouldn't say that English teacher lacks teeth, but I do get the criticism because I think it stems from this idea that, the reason why these conversations in English teacher don't go off the rails like they do in real life is because none of the characters here are bringing any real toxic energy to the conversation as we often see that happen, right? Like, I mean, the jocks are, they might be ignorant, but they're not hateful. Same with the gun-loving, sensitive, teacher there, right? So the show's a bit fanciful in the way that there's no one here that has any toxic energy. You might even feel like it's utopian, and that's where it feels unrealistic.
Yeah,
and
it's a comedy.
It's not going to play. It's not playing out like we had these. But the thing is, you need that. Like, you couldn't have these conversations that way. And you couldn't even have the laughs. Like, it wouldn't be this funny if that toxic energy was brought into it. So you need this safe space so that we could skewer this culture in the way that the show skewers the culture.
I am interested enough to go and watch the episodes that are available. But Rad and Mel, I got to leave it there. I appreciate the two of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thanks so much.
See you guys soon, of course. Mel Woods is a senior editor at Extra Magazine in Vancouver, and Rad Simonpillai is a film critic with CBC and CTV. You can stream English Teacher right now on Disney+. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Okay, so this year we've seen a very specific trend in movies. These are movies centered on middle-aged women, most of them mothers, who are finding an intense sexual awakening with younger men. There was Anne Hathaway in The Idea of You. There's a French movie last summer. There's Nicole Kidman in A Family Affair. Actually, come to think of it, Nicole Kidman also in Baby Girl, which has the exact same dynamic. That movie is about to come out at the Toronto International Film Festival. Rachel Handler is calling this moment MILF cinema. She's written an exhaustive guide about what is going on here. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, listen, I'm excited to talk about this. Listen, you just published this piece in Vulture. What does a movie or a character have to do to land in this bucket? Some examples.
Well, I want to be clear too that I'm calling it new MILF cinema because this is a trope that's been around before. So this is not, it's sort of like the new version of this trope.
Yeah.
And I think the new version is, she's thin, she's rich, she's white, she's beautiful, she looks very young, her life is together, she's got her career is flourishing, she's got really nice clothes, everything's going well for her, except, romantically.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the trope is that like, she's a little unfulfilled. And then, this young man comes along and she couldn't, but she has to, and she's finding herself in these relationships.
Rachel, there's a moment where something, stops being a random cluster and starts being a trend. When did it start to feel like, you know what, something is going on here. There's enough, there's enough nebula to sort of gather gravitational pull. When did you start to go, no, this is a trend?
Well, I saw last summer at Cannes, which is the French movie, not really a rom-com, but fits in the trope in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then I watched Between the Temples, which is the indie rom-com version. And then I saw Idea of You, and then Family Affair. And then it dawned on me that Baby Girl was coming out, and I was like, Nicole Kidman's doing this twice, in
the same year. Yeah, in about 4 months apart.
And I was like, okay, this is definitely a trend.
Yeah.
If Nicole Kidman is doing something twice in 3 months, it's a trend. That's just how it works.
That's good enough for me. Look, you called it a sort of a new moment here. How are these characters portrayed in the past, do you think?
So in the past, it was interesting because in my piece, I talk about there are sort of variations on the theme over the years, MILF as pariah or MILF as object. So rarely was the MILF the subject or the protagonist of the film. She was sort of an object for the protagonist, obviously usually a young man, like in The Graduate, for example. And then in the 90s, we had MILF as gag or as a joke with Jennifer Coolidge. I mean, obviously she's in on the joke, but it was sort of played up for laughs. And then, we started to take it a little more seriously with How Stella Got Her Groove Back or Something's Gotta Give.
Yeah.
And so there were examples of this, in the early aughts, late 90s, but it didn't really spawn the trend that we're seeing now where it's like one movie after another about kind of the same thing.
Yeah, Stifler's Mom was a sort of a one-of-a-kind moment.
Yes.
Can I just say, this is a conversation we've had a little bit on the show in a couple of different ways. So we've talked, when The Idea of You came out, we talked a little bit of age gap relationships being portrayed in pop culture. But then also fairly recently, we talked about the book All Fours by Miranda July. And the way that conversation was framed is to talk about why people are reacting in such a significant way to these works, whether it's Miranda July's book or these movies, because it shouldn't be, I don't think, surprising or even transgressive to go like, hey, people in their middle age still have ravenous desires. But it still kind of lands as a surprise, as a shock. There's something kind of like, ooh, let's go investigate this kind of, darkness that there is here. What do you think it is about this trope that keeps it coming back in that light, do you think?
That's interesting. When I was watching these movies, and I love Miranda July's book too, and Miranda July's book to me did feel a little more transgressive for some reason, because I think it wasn't falling into ultimately like very sort of traditional heterosexual dynamics, right? Because these movies are ultimately just they're just love stories, that the type of love stories we've always seen about straight people. And I think, it bums me out to imagine that we're still at a place societally where it's transgressive or shocking for a movie like this. But I would argue that actually the movies sort of do the work of saying, okay, yeah, this is a little transgressive, but it's actually okay. But ultimately are still pretty conservative politically. But Miranda July's book, I lump it into the trend sort of in cheek, but I think that book is genuinely doing something fresh.
Do you think there's something particular about this moment right now that calls for this specific topic? Like, do you think there's something happening right now that is like, what we need is like a new renaissance in MILF cinema? Like, what is it about right now that it makes it, the time for this to be happening?
Well, I sort of jokingly talk about this in my piece where, I'm like, is it that we've been abandoned by our institutions and our social safety nets, and we're all having like a mommy crisis, and we need to divert that in some Freudian way into our art.
Yeah.
Because we don't have movie stars being born anymore. This is a conversation we've been talking about for a long time. There aren't the big sort of 90s or earlier movie stars that are popping up in the same way. And so maybe there's this pressure, okay, we have to write something new for the Anns and the Nicoles, and here's something that they haven't done before. Is it that? Is it, is there something bubbling up, in the collective unconscious about the mommy and me, as I call it, the mommy and me kink?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. I mean, I genuinely don't know why right now. I think it's just kind of one of those things that happens in cinema where you see the same movie kind of popping up over and over again. And maybe in retrospect, we'll be able to say, oh, like socially, there was something going on here. And we can sort of tie it to the politics of the moment. But I honestly don't know exactly why right now.
Well, it's also a little bit tough to pin down, a couple weeks after it's been a week after, Baby Girl premiered and it comes to Toronto next week. We're in the thick of it. We're sort of still in the thick of it. It's only kind of like after the fact that we kind of look back and go, this may have been the thing that is happening in that moment. Do you think the trope is here to stay, or do you think it has, a sort of longevity into next year, or is it kind of a moment that's maybe a brief flash in the pan that's going to be over?
I mean, my hope is that it just becomes more of a normal thing that happens at a film, and it's not like everyone's like, oh, she's dating a younger man. I would hope that it just kind of gets weaved into cinema in the way that it would get weaved into our real lives. Like with Cher dating a much younger man. Like, this is just, I hope that it becomes non-shocking, and therefore isn't like the point of the movie anymore, right? It's like how queer cinema has evolved and continues to evolve, where it's no longer just about like the coming out story. It's like this person is just living their lives. And so I would hope that the trend kind of exhausts itself after a while, because there's only so many times we can be shocked, by this.
I mean, the idea that like moving beyond shock makes me think of during the press conference, I think for Queer, Daniel Craig was asked, I think it was Daniel Craig who was asked about whether we'll ever see a gay James Bond, because of course Daniel Craig is a star of Queer, and also he was James Bond. And the director's response was, "Hey, can we be grown-ups for a moment? Can we just all be adults in the room for a minute?" I think like that's the work of cinema, is to eventually push us to a place that is like, okay, let's not be shocked about this. Can we just process it and move on? You know what I mean?
And I don't think it's shocking anymore in real life. Like, at least not in my life. So I would hope that the sort of plot doesn't hinge on the transgression. Yeah.
I completely agree. Let's end with some recommendations. What are top 3 new MILF cinema movies that you'd recommend?
Oh, new MILF. Well, this isn't quite new. My favorite of all of the ones that I wrote about that are new, I love Between the Temples. It's Nathan Silver's movie with Carol Kane. I think that one does a really good job of moving past the idea of it as a transgression. And it also isn't as like literal of a romantic story as the others. But one of my favorites is Adore, which is the Naomi Watts, Robin Wright movie from, I think, 2013. It's an Australian film where they both have sex with each other's sons. Just a delightfully weird, truly, actually transgressive and shocking movie. Really, really fun. And then this isn't necessarily, I mean, I guess if I had to pick between the sort of straight rom-coms that I've talked about, I would say The Idea of You. That one's fun.
The Idea of You was a great time. Truly a great watch. A good role for Anne Hathaway. I had the best time. I have a feeling that after we both see Baby Girl, we'll be back here again talking about Nicole Kidman and Baby Girl, because that feels like it's pushing the boundaries of this category even further. And so I don't know. That's my guess. Yeah, for sure. 100%. Rachel Handler, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here, friend. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet. Talk to you soon. Rachel Handler writes for Vulture and New York Magazine. She was in New York City. That is it for the podcast today. Look, if you are listening on a podcast, please give us a follow on your podcast app. You can also find us on YouTube. We're on Instagram at CommotionCBC. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We will be back tomorrow. And I'm really excited to talk about this really controversial story that has to do with Elle Canada, the magazine. We'll tell you all about it tomorrow. I will see you then.